Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bash Course Quarantine U.S. History Edition. It's the man behind the camera and the cult of personality, young Tom Ritchie here, and I'll teach you all about the Truman Administration. So, we're starting off with Unit 8, which we just finished, and this part will probably not be on the AP exam, but will be really good for complexity points on those essays this year, because coronavirus. So, let me give you a little background, right? World War II has just ended. America has gone from an isolationist foreign policy to more active foreign policy. And basically, the U.S. has a lot of new responsibilities to take, both abroad and at home. First, we will mention the domestic side of things. So, as World War II is about to end, you have millions of veterans who are about to come home and who can't necessarily assimilate into the economy, all that well. The economy is a lot different than pre-World War II, and that's why we need a thing what's known as the GI Bill, signed by actually FDR, as you can see a picture right here. So the GI Bill was signed during the war in 1944 and helped veterans obtain a college education and low interest loans for homes and businesses from the federal government. And this was incredibly successful. It helped influence the booming post war economic expansion that we would see in the 1950s. And this basically solidified FDR's legacy among at least Democrats. Um, and so now we're seeing once World War II is over, America has changed as a whole. And we're see the rise of what's known as the prototypical American dream for many families. And as you can see a picture here, we have the mother and father, and then the son and daughter, and then even though it's not pictured here, generally there's a pet involved. And as you can see, this family's living in the suburbs, with your wide open lawn and stuff. So America experienced an economic boom, more Americans had disposable income, and so they were able to buy products such as refrigerators, washing machines, cars, etc. And this used to be considered luxuries, but now they're more of necessities, especially in our modern day. Excuse me. And now, of course, all these new products needed a place to live, as the city wasn't the best place. So we see the rise of the suburbs. Most notably, the first suburb was known as Levittown, built in 1947. And so from there, we see the real rise of suburbia in America. The idea of the white picket fence, that sort of what some say will be a romantic concept that cannot come to fruition, but others say this was a rational, reasonable success of America. And the sad thing, though, is that even though most people were moving up into the middle class, African Americans did not receive as much of the benefit as they should have. Right? They were bogged down by housing discrimination and redlining and predatory loans and other encumbrances. And so we have this new way of life for Americans. We now have a growing middle class, very affluent, rising standard of living. And so now let's go over to politics. So as for politics, uh, Truman had a series of progressive reforms that he wanted to bring out, such as national health insurance, which failed sadly, uh, liberal Democrats at the time, and which was actually helped stopped by Southern Democrats, known as Dixiecrats, and also conservative Republicans, which would stop these brand new liberal policies. Harry Truman also tried to pass, meaningful civil rights legislation that generally failed, but he did, however, create a committee on civil rights in 1946, which did result in the desegregation of the federal government, including armed forces. All right, other important legislation from his first term. We have the 22nd Amendment, which officially limited a president to two full terms because FDR was just, an OG. He went for 4 terms during the war. We have the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947, which was passed over Truman's veto. It was mainly Republican legislation. It was mostly anti-union. and this basically started huge, fights in post-World War II America between Republicans and Democrats. So we're now the election of 1948, and the Democratic Party is sort of, splintering in a way. You have one wing, you have Harry Truman, a generally moderate Democrat, but then you have more liberal Democrats led by Harry Wallace, known as progressives, and then during this election you have the rise of the Dixiecrats or Southern Democrats, generally uh, pro-segregationist Democrats. And the Republicans on the other side had Thomas E. Dewey. Now, Dewey was expected to win, but in a major upset, Truman pulled off the dub. And so we have Truman promising a fair deal, similar to a New Deal that FDR had. This fair deal will include civil rights, national health insurance, and federal aid to schools. Again, most were struck down by conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats, except for higher minimum wage and expansion of Social Security. Now, looking at Truman's foreign policy, the Cold War has started, as we know, ever since the fall of Nazi Germany and imperialist Japan, and we have the Truman Doctrine, known as containment, which would become the standard for U.S. foreign policy towards the Soviet Union and communism for quite a few decades. We also have the creation of NATO, which was a bloc formed to encumber communism and the Soviet Union into Europe. And we have what's known as the Marshall Plan, which is one of Truman's most successful and greatest achievements, and probably of America's foreign policy in general. Basically, the U.S. unloaded fat stacks of cash onto many European nations to help them rebuild their economies after the horrible World War, which was very damaging to their economy and society as a whole. And the U.S. even offered it to the Eastern European nations, but they were under Soviet influence, and Soviet Union was like, no, 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 right? And so we also have the Berlin airlift, which was basically the U.S. dropping supplies into Berlin when the Soviet Union sort of stopped them at their gates, closed the roads and bridges. And after a little bit, the Soviet Union did relent. So that was a foreign policy victory for the Americans there, especially in this time. The Marshall Plan and NATO is really important. What you gotta know. As for another thing, the nuke, right? Soviets basically upgraded their in-game character in the game of life, and they unlocked the nuke in 1949. This made people really nervous, and this basically started the Cold War arms race, as we know. And let's move further east to Asia now. So the U.S. gave independence to the Philippines in 1946, and in the late 1940s, China was fighting a civil war, which ended in a communist victory. And the U.S. also ended military occupations of Korea and Japan in 1948 and 1952, respectively. Also, the first anime feature film, Momotaro Umi no Shinpai, came out in 1945, so that's exciting for us anime lovers. As for Korea, you have the North, the Communist North, led by Kim Il sung, the granddaddy of North Korea and granddaddy of Kim Jong un. And then you also have in the South Syngman Rhee, a conservative, pro-American president. And basically in 1950, Kim Il sung surprised everyone by trying to unify the peninsula by invading the South. And so he was basically able to push the South and quite a few American troops all the way down to what was known as the Pusan perimeter, as you can see here, the red line. After a little bit, UN forces, again, mainly led by US, pulled an okie doke, right? They were like basically, they had us in the first half, not going to lie. And they pushed the North all the way back to their border with China, as you can see. However, China sent troops to help the North, and the war was basically a stalemate until 1953 when there was an armistice. Even though there's no current conflict between North and South, there's still a lot of tension and the war isn't officially over. This was considered a success of containment because communism didn't spread to the South, and even the South Korea today is a very big juggernaut in economics and technology and very successful. And with the rise of communism, not only do you have hot wars abroad, but you also had, Red Scare at home, the second Red Scare. And mainly this was instigated by Joseph McCarthy, who took this on to raise his national persona, in the interest of himself. He accused everyone of being a communist in the U.S. government, and without evidence. And people generally went on with his beliefs until the Army McCarthy hearings, where he uh, basically accused the Army of having communists infiltrate at the highest levels. However, he made an ass out of himself as hearings and ended his entire political career. So this was basically everything you need to know, at least the basics of the Truman administration. And next episode, we have the Eisenhower years. This is Young Richie signing off.